The biggest what-ifs in UFC history. In a sport where inches could be the difference between a fighter's career success or failure, there tend to be lots of what-if moments. Okay, we keep imagining what could have happened if Herb Dean never separated Usman and Leon in the 5th round. Or, what if Peter Yan never landed that knee on Sterling? But those are nothing compared to the crazy what-ifs that have happened in UFC's long history. What if Brock Lesnar had fought earlier? Everyone knew the kind of crazy athleticism Brock Lesnar had. He had conquered the WWE and was an NCAA #1. But despite his body already being beaten down by wrestling, Brock wanted to conquer the world of MMA as well. But the UFC was slow on this one, as they couldn't get him signed under their banner until he was 31 years old. But despite that, he quickly became one of the greatest fighters on the planet. Immediately upon getting to the UFC, he was fast-tracked and every one of his opponents were hard fights. At the end of his remarkable career, he had 5 wins, 3 losses, and 1 no contest. While on paper his record doesn't look earth-shattering, his title victories and performances did. Brock Lesnar became the heavyweight champion and even had title defenses during his short stint in the UFC. He was the pay-per-view king of the UFC, taking its numbers to astronomical levels. But Lesnar was not the well-rounded kind of fighter, as he sucked at anything other than wrestling. Just imagine the kind of beast he would have been had he trained MMA sooner. But one thing everyone doesn't realize is that signing Lesnar was a risky move for the UFC. Since the UFC was in its early stages, people weren't clear on whether the UFC was real fighting or if it was just an updated version of the WWE. And Lesnar's signature didn't help matters. But in hindsight, it did. Okay, that's one fighter leaving the WWE and joining the UFC. But what would have happened had Ken Shamrock not done the exact reverse? What if Ken Shamrock never took that break? MMA what-ifs don't get much bigger than Ken Shamrock's career. He's in the UFC Hall of Fame, and the man even has the longest fight in UFC history with Royce Gracie at UFC 5. Ken Shamrock was at the peak of his powers in 1996 when he decided to leave the UFC. He was only 1 fight from being the UFC Super Fight Champion when he decided to head back to his pro wrestling roots and join WWE. When Shamrock returned to the MMA 4 years later, he was a shell of his former self. He could never seem to find his footing, mainly because he spent his prime years wrestling. It's not hard to imagine how his career could have gone if he wouldn't have left in 1996. Going back to his first fight in the UFC, Shamrock competed in the UFC's first ever event, UFC 1. Although he initially believed it to be a professional wrestling event, he decided to sign up nonetheless. Shamrock won his first fight, but ended up losing to Royce Gracie by rear naked choke. The ending of the fight was also controversial, as the referee did not see the tap and ordered the 2 fighters to continue fighting after Gracie had let go of the hold. Shamrock paused for a few seconds, but declined, admitting to the ref that he had tapped out, and that it would not be fair for him to continue fighting. Shamrock made a comeback to the octagon at UFC 3, in an event that was marketed by the UFC as the ultimate rematch between 2-time champion Royce Gracie and #1 contender Shamrock. In this tournament, he won the quarters and semis, but refused to compete in the finals when he learned Royce had withdrawn. He came back to compete in UFC 5, 6, 7, 8, and UFC 9 until he decided to take a break at a time when he seemed to be in the form of his life. When he came back, he was a tomato can, and he lost 11 of his last 14 fights in the promotion. During his disappointing late career, UFC president Dana White said this about him: "Ken Shamrock was in a beef with us over his contract. We thought he retired. He was claiming he didn't and still had 1 fight. And my attitude was, I'd rather pay Ken Shamrock to not fight. I'd rather pay him to not fight and just say, stay home, Ken. Ken is way past his prime. It gets to the point where it's dangerous for that guy to still be fighting." What if TJ Grant had never suffered that concussion? If you've been watching MMA for a while, then you must know of the what-if career of TJ Grant. TJ Grant's entire career is a massive what-if. Grant was just an average UFC welterweight until he dropped to the lightweight division in 2011. Following the change of divisions, he quickly became a contender. He kept on destroying everyone in his path, and when he knocked out Gray Maynard, he was next in line for a UFC lightweight title shot. However, he never got to fight for gold. Grant suffered a bad concussion in training and couldn't be cleared. As a result, he never returned to MMA. Would he have gone on to be the champ? We will never know. What if Fedor fought in the UFC? But the biggest what if in MMA history has got to be what would have happened had Fedor Emelianenko fought in the UFC. Fedor is a household name in the UFC and the greatest fighter ever not to compete in the UFC. In fact, many regard him as the all-time GOAT of MMA. I mean, Fedor has 40 wins and just 6 losses. And his 40 victories are no joke, as he fought for almost all the major promotions. The fact that he hasn't fought top competition in the UFC is always a hot topic. But Fedor coming to the UFC was a thing that almost happened several times. According to Fedor's manager, the UFC made an offer. True. We had a conference call with them, and Fedor asked them to send the offer to him by mail. They did. After that, he went to the USA to a Bellator event where his deal with Rizin was announced. I didn't know he was going to do that. I learned that from mass media. So as far as I know, he didn't reject a UFC offer, he just didn't give them any answer. But according to Fedor, he didn't sign with the UFC because of their one-sided contracts, which limited his autonomy. He said, "The UFC contract was just draconian and oppressive. I'm not ready to sign such an enslaving contract. First of all, they should show respect for the fighters, the kind of respect I receive in Japan." The closest he came was in 2009 when he nearly signed to fight Brock Lesnar. However, negotiations fell apart, and now fans will just have to wonder how that dream fight and many others could have gone. Despite never competing in the UFC, Fedor is no doubt one of the GOATs. What if Tony never got tripped by that wire? But talking about fights that were destined to never happen, there is no bigger disappointment than Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. The UFC has missed out on some massive fights over the years. However, none sting worse than Khabib versus Tony. The two competitors were the best fighters on the planet at the time, and they were scheduled 5 times to compete. More than once, the fight didn't happen because of the Khabib camp. Injuries and not being able to make weight are some of the reasons. But once again, the fight was set. However, this time it was Ferguson who was forced out. Somehow, he managed to tear his knee ligaments apart after stumbling on the set of a pre-fight media scrum. And another time, it was Ferguson who was yet again sidelined. A lung issue forced him out and left Nurmagomedov to squash late replacement Daryl Horcher. But the UFC attempted to make this fight happen for the 4th time, but once again, disaster struck. This time, the event, UFC 209, was less than a day away when a botched weight cut forced Khabib out of the fight, causing the UFC to have to call it off once again. Perhaps Khabib should have used the services of the Trifecta meal plan to get the healthy foods he needed to stay on weight. And even though UFC 209 was in New York, I'm sure the Trifecta company had no problems bringing it right to his doorstep. In the end, they never fought in the cage. With Nurmagomedov now retired and Ferguson on a losing streak, this one will have to sit in fans' imaginations. To this day, El Cucuy is still chapped that he never got a shot at Nurmagomedov. But even if the fight happened, it couldn't have had an impact like Conor McGregor leaving MMA to do boxing. What if Conor never fought Floyd? It's easy to forget, but in 2017, Conor McGregor was arguably the greatest fighter on the planet. He was a 2-division champion in the UFC in arguably the 2 hardest divisions in the promotion. He held victories over names such as Jose Aldo, Eddie Alvarez, Chad Mendes, and Max Holloway before he took a boxing match against Floyd Mayweather. Although he made lots of bank from the fight, one can't deny that it affected his prime and he lost his hunger for MMA. The boxing match happened at the peak of his athleticism, and the money and fame might have stopped Conor from becoming what he could have been. While the Notorious took home a massive payday for fighting Floyd, it's hard not to imagine the legacy he could have had if he would have stayed active in MMA. Well, MMA is the sport of surprises, and some things were never meant to be. What if Brock versus Fedor happened? Or what if TJ Grant never suffered that concussion? The thing is, we'll never know. But one thing I'm sure you know is you should like, comment, and click the subscribe bell.